Hour number 2 of Orange Nation underway on ESPN Radio. Huey Lewis in the News, our artist of the day. This is Heart and Soul. It's the 40th anniversary of their breakthrough album called Sports. And with that, we kick off hour number 2 by going to our guest line. He is the voice of Purdue football, Tim Newton, our guest on the show. Tim, great to have you on. How are you today?
I'm doing fine. How are you guys today?
We're doing well. We're doing well. I want to start, if we could, with last year's game. There's been a lot of talk here about last year's game. Curious if there's been a lot of talk out there in West Lafayette, Indiana, about last year's game. And we all remember how it went. You know, Purdue takes a late lead. We think the game's over. A couple of unsportsmanlike penalties give Syracuse some quality field position. They take advantage of it. They score with 7 seconds left, and they steal one. Is there this sense of, payback this week for Purdue, or is it with a different coaching staff, a lot of new players, new quarterback? Has that been downplayed this week?
I would say it probably is less of a payback than it would have been a few years ago when the rosters were a little bit more stable, because you've got, as you mentioned, a new coaching staff and you have a lot of new players. But I can tell you, the guys that were here last year remember the end of the game, and certainly this game's been circled for a while. So I don't know, payback is the right word, but it's an opportunity for Purdue to get a non-conference win and go into the conference season that starts next week with some momentum, and also protecting the home field after they lost their opener here to Fresno State.
Tim, looking, yes, it's a completely, different offense when you look at Aiden O'Connell not being there, Charlie Jones not being there. A guy had, Syracuse fans probably still have nightmares of him catching balls in the dome out of his 110 that he caught last year. But what are a couple of names we look at Hudson Card offensively that Syracuse fans should be worried about?
Well, Hudson Card is the main cog. He's the quarterback, and he runs that air raid offense with Graham Harrell, the offensive coordinator, who was a standout at Texas Tech and learned his trade under Mike Leach. Devin Mockabee is a guy that's going to get a lot of carries tomorrow night. He is a sophomore who almost became the first Purdue freshman in program history to rush for 1,000 yards as a freshman. Fell just a little bit short, but he has been picking up here he had 95 yards the last time out against Virginia Tech. He'll get the ball a lot. They spread the ball around a lot. Deion Burks is their big play threat. He had a couple of touchdown passes in the opener, but I think you'll see a lot more of the tight ends. Garrett Miller and Max Clare have become a big part of the offense. So those are some of the names to watch for on the offensive side. But it's Hudson Card who makes the offense go. And so far, Purdue is one of 9 teams nationally that has not had a turnover in the first 2 games.
Well, that'll help, especially if this one goes down to the fourth quarter. That's something that we've been talking about this week here, is the fact that Purdue has played in 2 really close games, both decided by a possession. Syracuse obviously has not. They've played lesser opponents. Both the games were decided by halftime. Does that give Purdue a little bit of an edge if this is as close as everyone expects it to be, the fact that they've had some of those crunch time situations already under their belt this year?
Well, I don't think it'll hurt, but I think probably the biggest edge Purdue has tomorrow night is the 60,000 people in the stands are going to be wearing gold and black.
Sure.
And even though Syracuse didn't fill the place up last year, it gets loud in the dome, and I know there's going to be an electric atmosphere here tomorrow night. The weather, unlike last week, is scheduled to be perfect. I mean, it should be like 70 degrees with very little wind at kickoff. No rain in the forecast, so it's going to be a perfect night for football. But yeah, I do think the fact that Purdue has gone into the fourth quarter now of both of its first 2 games and had to find a way to try to win, and pulling off at least one of the 2 times, certainly that will help a little bit going into tomorrow night's game.
Tim, let's step away from this week's game and just look at last week. What was that like? I'm flipping on the TV screen. I'm like, what channel is this game on now? What is going on down there in Blacksburg? Can you, as a broadcaster, walk me through what was that like?
Well, I can tell you the way our network is set up, when we have a delay, and this is the 3rd delay I've been involved with, although this was by far the longest. Once we're on the air, we have to stay on the air. It's unlike some places where you can throw it back to the studio and they can do whatever. We were on the air 10 hours and 36 minutes on Saturday, and there were a couple of segments that were pre-recorded that we could go with. We were probably, I would say, out of that 10 and a half hours, we probably filled 6 or 7 from the booth, and we knew going into the day. You looked at the forecast all week long, and they had called for this big thunderstorm parade to come through Saturday right around game time, and Unfortunately, for once, the weather forecasters were right, and it was, we had probably, we got there to the stadium about 10 o'clock. It was a noon kickoff, and the rain started a little after 11. It rained nonstop for about 5 hours, and in that period, they had 4.5 inches of rain,
Wow.
which I think was like the second most they'd ever had in one day in Blacksburg. And the amazing part of it was, now this is a natural grass field, the drainage system there, it was incredible. They had these machines that came out, and basically they were taking the water out from underneath the field. Mm-hmm. Our sideline reporter says his shoes weren't even wet. And that's unbelievable because when it was raining and in the full bore of that storm, there was standing water on the field, and we wondered at that point, are they going to be able to finish this game? But I thought they did a phenomenal job getting the field ready. I was surprised. We had 65,000 people there at kickoff. We probably still had, I would say, 15,000 came back for the restart 5.5 hours later. So it was an amazing day. It was a great experience, and one we hope to never have to go through again.
Singing show tunes at about 4 o'clock in the afternoon.
Something you will never forget, no doubt. Curious, Tim, to get your thoughts on this Syracuse team. You've spent the week preparing for this game. You obviously saw them up close and personal last year, and a lot of the key figures are back. Garrett Schrader, Rondé Gaston, although he likely will not play tomorrow. Certainly Dino Babers and the coaching staff. What are your thoughts about this Syracuse squad?
Well, there's no question Schrader's the guy that makes the offense go. I think they're a very quarterback-driven offense, which is true for a lot of teams. But I remember in last year's game, he really hurt Purdue running more than he did throwing, and that's something that I think Purdue's going to have to be very disciplined tomorrow night in terms of rushing the passer and making sure they stay in their lanes. But I remember, again, it seemed like on every time they had a 3rd and 10 or a 3rd and long, he would tuck the ball and find a way to get the first down. So that's job number one, is to keep him from getting out of the pocket and scrambling. Defensively, I think we're expecting a lot of movement on that Syracuse defense. They start out in a 3-3-5, but when they snap the ball, you could have 4 guys at the line, you could have 5 guys at the line. So it's going to be incumbent on the offensive line to be pretty sharp in terms of where the defenders are coming from. And also Hudson Card's going to have to be able to read that defense and maybe get the ball out of his hands at the right time. But I expect, just as our first 2 games have been, a game that goes down to the wire. I'd be surprised if tomorrow night's game isn't the same way.
Tim, what does Ryan Walters bring as a head coach to this football team that Purdue hasn't seen in the past couple of years?
Youth. He's 37. He's 37 years old, and I think he's got some energy that we haven't seen for a while. He relates really, really well to the players. He's got a very positive attitude. He's a very self-confident guy, and I think that confidence rubs off on his players. I think they believe in him. We've had people over at the athletic complex and over at the football performance complex say that they've seen more players around the complex here in the last few months since he was hired than they did in the previous 5 years combined. So guys, I think, really are gravitating to him and his staff. It's a very young staff. I think they've only got one coach on the staff that's over 50 years old. So, very young, very relatable players. It's proven out to be successful so far in terms of recruiting, because not only did they get a good haul out of the portal, including Hudson Card, but the class that they'll sign here in a couple of months is one of the best classes Purdue has had in a while. So I think he's somebody that players gravitate to. It'll be interesting. We're in week 3 now of a 12-week grind, so we'll see if that enthusiasm can stay the way it is all season long. But I think Ryan was a good counter to Jeff Brom. Jeff was a great football coach. Jeff was not the most, I don't think, personable coach in terms of his players. And I think this is a 180-degree turn from that with Ryan, and I think it's exactly what this program needed right now.
Tim, I know this isn't a conference game for either team, but it feels...
Are you sure? Because it seems like the conference has changed every week.
ACC Big Ten Challenge in football this week with about 10 teams playing each other.
Yeah, right. Yeah, right. Exactly. There's so much changeover. Who knows these days? But, I guess with that being said, at least from a Syracuse perspective, it seems like there's a lot of urgency with this game. And I'm curious if the same holds true with Purdue. Given that Purdue is 1-1, they lose this game. It seems like there's a big difference between 2-1 and 1-2 going into conference play. And, similarly with Syracuse, they're trying to get to bowl eligibility, and, every win matters. And this is one that they feel like it's a toss-up game, and this is one they can get. Even though it's not a conference game, does it feel like there's a little bit of urgency with this one?
Yeah, I do think, especially given Purdue's opening game loss to Fresno State, because if you look at the way the schedule is set up, this starts a 3-game homestand. Purdue plays Syracuse tomorrow night. They've got Wisconsin coming in here next Friday night. We haven't beaten Wisconsin since 2003, so that's a big game. And then Illinois the week after that. I think these next 3 games will determine Purdue's season in terms of whether it's going to be bowl eligible, whether it's going to be a contender in the Big Ten West Division. Losing the Fresno State game puts you a little bit behind the 8 ball. You hoped you were going to come into this game with a 2-0 record, but again, the Virginia Tech game was a toss-up, and we saw that game go down to the wire too. Yeah, there's a lot of urgency on this game, but I think again it goes back to you've lost a game at home. You really want to learn to protect the home field, so that becomes just as important as anything else, is making sure that teams that come into Ross-Ade Stadium know that they're going to be in for a battle every week.
Tim, I'm going to step away from the football aspect of things and just talk about the conference expansion a minute. And on the Syracuse side, when you're looking at Syracuse, you're saying, are we safe, being in the ACC? How do you picture Purdue? Like, how do Purdue fans picture now that all this has happened with the Big Ten? Is it kind of a sigh of relief?
Yeah, I think, I don't think we have a lot of fans who are very paranoid, and I'm sure every fan base has that group of people that, they're convinced that when they bring teams A, B, and C into the league, they're going to try and get rid of teams X, Y, and Z. I don't think that's the case here. I think Purdue is, especially if you look at Purdue's prowess now in basketball, but that's not the case. There's no danger of Purdue not being in the Big Ten Conference. I think the question for me is, as you look at the expansion, and when I started doing this job, there were only 10 teams in the Big Ten. You look at where they went, Penn State first, then Nebraska, then Maryland and Rutgers, and now USC, UCLA, Washington, Oregon. You see a pattern of, okay, we're trying to build the Big Ten network. We're trying to build eyeballs. So, yeah, let's go out. Nebraska, we know, is going to draw some attention in the Midwest, at least when they were good in football. They did. On the East Coast, you've got Rutgers, so you get the New York City market. You've got Maryland to get the Washington, D.C. market. Now you've gone out to USC and UCLA to get the Los Angeles market. So those are more eyeballs. I question whether Washington and Oregon bring that same do they bring that same growth potential? And now the fact is you're going to have more slices coming out of the pie. Can you make the pie bigger by adding those teams? So I question that. I'm also getting old, and I don't like long plane trips. So, from a personal standpoint, I'm not real thrilled about having 4 West Coast teams. But I think the inevitability of this is you're going to have, and I don't know if it's going to be 3, 4, 2, whatever, super conferences. Yeah. I don't think 18 is the end number. Everybody seems to think 20, but who knows if that's the end. The SEC, I'm kind of curious to see if they stay where they are. But what happens? Does the ACC continue to grow, and is it just that? And the Big 12, is that it? Does the Pac-12 just completely dissolve? Or do they try to poach other people and say, let's rebuild the Pac-12? Who knows where this is going to end? I just know that I have to look up every year to see who's in which conference, and as long as Purdue's in the Big Ten, I know at least I'll know some of the places that I can eat on the road when you go on road trips.
I've already pitched to Steve that trip to Palo Alto for Syracuse, and I do a special in Napa Valley. So
yeah,
I've done a couple of games out in Stanford, and it's a lovely place. It's a great campus, and I've done basketball games there, and Maples Pavilion is an interesting place to do a game.
Yeah, and just getting back to your idea of super conferences, like that's been a hot topic around here. We talked about that a lot over the summer here, was if it's 3 super conferences, I think people feel like Syracuse is safe. If it becomes 2 super conferences, where does Syracuse fall and what do things look like? So that's talking about the paranoid fan base. That's something we've been talking a lot about here locally. Listen, Tim, thanks so much for your time. I hope tomorrow is not a 10-hour day, but it's more of a reasonable 4 or 5 hour day for you. And hopefully we can do this again down the road.
Well, for any of your fans making the trips, we promise we will try to keep the lightning and rain away at least until Sunday here.
All right, that's a good deal. Tim Newton, our guest here on the show. And with that, we'll hit a timeout. We've got John Ryan coming up in about 15 minutes. We're back after this on ESPN Radio.